conservatives and Republican Party identifiers have been more supportive of Israel than Democrats and liberals. This has become a much more pronounced trend over the last 20 years, and one that we observe both among young evangelicals as well as evangelicals of all ages.
What do Christians think about Israel? What is their stance on Israel? And is the support for Israel dropping among young people? It seems that the more you talk to young people about these issues, the more they seem to distance themselves from a biblical worldview. Hi, and welcome to this episode, Inside the Epicenter with Joel Rosenberg, a podcast of the Joshua Fund, a ministry dedicated to blessing Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus. I'm Lynn Rosenberg with the Joshua Fund, and today we'll discuss the studies of Dr. Cyril Buman and Moti Inbari, talking about the shocking trend of the drop in Christian support for Israel.
Young evangelicals absorb and consume information differently than the older generations during their formative years. So this is really essential to understand in terms of understanding the differences that we observe in the generations.
Last week, Israel put an offer on the table for a 6-week ceasefire in Gaza and the release of nearly 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in return for Hamas releasing at least 24 live American and Israeli hostages. U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken called the Israeli offer, quote, extraordinarily generous. Take a look.
The quickest way to bring this to an end is to get to a ceasefire and the release of hostages. Hamas has before it a proposal that is extraordinarily generous on the part of Israel. And in this moment, the only thing standing between the people of Gaza and a ceasefire is Hamas. They have to decide, and they have to decide quickly. So we're looking to that, and I'm hopeful that they will make the right decision.
However, Hamas rejected the deal. Well, first, they said they accepted it, but what they accepted were terms that Israel hadn't even seen. Officially, Hamas rejected the deal that had been negotiated by Egypt, Qatar, and Israel, and the U.S., insisting instead that Israel agree to a full surrender in Gaza, the permanent end to the war, and Hamas resuming its rule of the Gaza Strip. Israel said absolutely not, this is out of the question, and began moving hundreds of thousands of Palestinians out of Rafa, and then began its long-announced invasion of Rafa, the southernmost city in the Gaza Strip, and the place where the top Hamas commanders and the last 4 divisions of Hamas terrorists are believed to be hiding. President Biden, however, apparently in a fit of anger at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for defying Biden's insistence that the IDF not go into Rafah to finish off Hamas once and for all, started blocking the shipment of American arms and munitions that were scheduled to be flown to Israel. According to the Times of Israel, quote, this is the first time since October 7th that the U.S. has held up a weapons shipment earmarked for Israel, unquote. I think this is absolutely reprehensible. Now, CIA Director William Burns arrived in Israel to meet with Netanyahu and other senior officials to try to find common ground and a way forward. Meanwhile, the U.S. has nearly completed building a new pier off the coast of Gaza that will allow more humanitarian aid supplies to enter the Gaza Strip after clearing through Israeli security checks. You can follow all the latest developments at All Israel News, and please keep praying for the Lord to set all the captives free, according to Isaiah 61. Now, we want to talk about a very important topic, and that is evangelical polling, evangelical attitudes towards Israel. And I want to bring in 2 guests to talk about their new book. It's a great new book, Christian Zionism in the 21st Century, American Evangelical Public Opinion on Israel. Now, I had an opportunity to work with these 2 social scientists, these 2 PhDs, professors, American professors. They're Jewish. They're not evangelical Christians. They're not believers in Jesus, as I am, but they have a real fascination fascination with why evangelicals love Israel or don't, and they've done some of the most important polling and analysis of American evangelical attitudes. And the reason it's important is because evangelical support among young people appears to be dropping, and that's a real concern, evangelical young people's support for Israel. And we want to talk about why. But first, let me bring in Dr. Moti Inbari and Dr. Carol Booman, two, again, social scientists, professors. They're the authors of this fascinating new book. And Moti and Carol, it's been great working with you over the last 6 or 7 years now on a range of surveys you've done. Thank you for coming, both of you.
Thank you.
It's great to have you guys.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Well, Moti, let's start with you. Big picture, what have you found over the course of all these surveys that you guys have done that gives us the big picture understanding of how evangelicals overall see Israel and the Jewish people?
Yeah, so this is a very large question, and we have we have to bring it into a smaller question. And you brought the issue of young evangelicals. We also studied the influence of eschatology, and we came up with some very interesting findings. Also, the role of politics, socialization. There are multiple layers in which evangelicals meet Israel, and we, piece by piece, were able to bring into the big picture, to see the big picture of what motivates evangelicals to support Israel or not to support Israel. It's not necessarily there's just one way of looking at Israel. Yeah.
So if you lump everybody together in your overall surveys without breaking out subsections like people under 30, would you still say that evangelicals overwhelmingly support Israel's right to exist and support Israel politically, economically, and so forth?
Yeah, I think of all the Christian movements in the United States, evangelicals are the strongest support for Israel overall. It is also that this support is showing signs of declining as well.
Yeah. All right. So, Carol, let's drill into some of that. First of all, why, based on all the research that you and Moti have been doing, why do the evangelicals who do support Israel, and that's still a very large and strong number, why do evangelicals support Israel? And then we'll get into the question of why are younger evangelicals starting to drift away from that?
So when we look at the individual level at respondents one by one, we see that political ideology and partisanship matters quite a bit. This is not a new trend. Historically, conservatives and Republican Party identifiers have been more supportive of Israel than Democrats and liberals. This has become a much more pronounced trend over the last 20 years, and one that we observe both among young evangelicals as well as evangelicals of all ages. In fact, that trend persists across multiple religious communities that we've studied. In addition to that, there are a number of theological and eschatological. Eschatology refers to the study of end times. Right. There's a lot of theological and eschatological reasons for support for Israel. The most prominent one of which is the so-called Abrahamic covenant, belief that the God's covenant with the Jewish people is eternal, and that the Christians that support this Abrahamic covenant will receive blessings in return. In addition to that, biblical literalism, that is, preference of reading the Bible in a literalist sense, has been a pretty important factor for evangelical support of Israel. Additionally, we found that socialization is a major contributor. In simple terms, you are who you hang out with. If you spend a lot of time with pro-Israel group, if you discuss the importance of Israel with other Christians, you are far more likely to support Israel. Again, this finding persists for evangelicals of all ages, although we do get a pretty interesting nuance among young evangelicals where the trend is reversed. Yeah. So talking more frequently to young evangelicals actually causes a sort of teenage rebellion of sorts where they express lower levels of support for Israel as a result of such socialization.
I want to get into that in a moment, because I think that was a counterintuitive finding in your study, that as you talk about Israel with young people more, they seem to resist it. So we need to unpack that in a few moments.
Our verse of the day today is from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. In whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them. Our prayer requests that we would ask you to join in prayer about include praying that God will intervene, that all of the captives held by Hamas would be set free. And please be praying for young people in Israel, the Middle East, and the United States, all around the world, that the next generation would come to know the living Messiah, Jesus.
Moti, back to you. Let's just back up for a moment and talk about why did you get so interested in evangelical support, at multiple age ranges for Israel and the Jewish people?
Yeah, well, it's a long story, but I would say that I teach at a university in North Carolina in the Bible Belt, and I'm living in the North Carolina, and I realized, that that's a big thing, support for Israel. And so little by little, I started, asking questions, speaking with my neighbors, speaking with other people that brought me to, concentrate on this question. Why do so many people in the South, in the United States, support Israel from a religious point of view? This is how it started, yes.
And Kirill, how about for you?
I think it's very similar to Moti's interest. I'm a political scientist by trade, and my previous research had nothing to do with public opinion in general. But as a child, I remember reading the Bible, growing up in the atheist Soviet Union, and I was fascinated by Revelations. And so returning to the story in the Revelations and returning to that very, poignant and very strong kind of language, and looking how that might impact public attitudes towards a very contemporary and very difficult to resolve ethnic conflict has been really kind of a return to childhood in some respects. But yeah, so this desire to understand the religious as well as underpinnings of support for Israel has really driven my interests.
The thing that I'm concerned about, and the reason my colleagues and I started helping fund these type of studies and trying to understand what's happening, and we were very honored to work with you guys, was because we anecdotally, evangelical leaders were sensing young people were turning against Israel. Now, I think that may not actually be true, but it felt true, and I think yours analysis and your data is showing mostly young evangelicals are moving into the I don't know category, or I support neither Israelis or Palestinians, not necessarily into the hostile, I'm against Israel. But Kirill, let's start with you. Do I have that right? Is that a fair way to look at your data?
That is correct. While we did see some increases in support for the Palestinians, the sort of the loss of support for Israel went predominantly in this middle category that you identified correctly, Joel, support neither. So there has been some improvement in terms of how much the data tells us about support for the Palestinians, but much of it is really support neither.
Okay, so Moti, as you look at the data and as you slice it from a number of different directions, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 reasons that you guys are identifying that younger evangelicals under the age of 30, let's say, are not seeing Israel with the same strength of support and rock solid support that their parents and grandparents have demonstrated?
Yeah, and we asked in our survey the respondents to answer, and we got 700 responses to this question. Why is it so? Why is it happening that the support is decreasing? And the number one response that we got was that, listen, we are a different generation. We think differently from our parents. We have different views from our parents. We understand the Bible differently from our parents. And so I think this is the main issue. There is a generational divide here. The generations think differently about social and political aspects, and they express it. They say, we are just different. We are not the same people as our parents. We are not a clone of our parents. Another major response was we just don't know. We don't know enough. I think this is a ray of light for us, for the educators. If people say that they don't know, let's teach them.
Yeah, all right, that's a great point. But there are 2 other things that jumped out at me, Kirill, that I want us to go into. one of which you mentioned, I believe, was earlier on in the first block, and that is a young evangelical's political identification is having a direct impact on how they see Israel. And you guys saw a significant increase in young evangelicals identifying themselves as either moderate or liberal compared to their parents and grandparents, who were significantly, if not entirely, they weren't entirely conservative, but they're much more conservative than their kids and their grandkids. So support for Biden went up significantly. I think 45% of young evangelicals under 30 supported Biden as opposed to Trump. So talk about the political analysis of how a young evangelical's political views affect their view of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as Moti pointed out, young evangelicals told us themselves that it's the generational differences. Through asking them a number of additional questions, we were able to gauge where those differences really lie. And one of those areas is in the issues related to social justice. So we asked our respondents to answer questions related to their concerns about global warming, income inequality, support for Black Lives Matter, and concerns about racial inequality. And what we found was that young people were significantly more likely to express those sorts of attitudes. And additionally, we found that despite a relatively high level of concern about anti-Semitism in the United States, young evangelicals simply did not see anti-Semitism as a part and parcel of their social justice concerns. It was a division in the way they perceived those other issues: income inequality, global warming, racial inequality, and anti-Semitism. So in the minds of young evangelicals, social justice does not entail fighting anti-Semitism, and the perception is much more akin to the conventional kind of liberal or leaning liberal individual than you see with the older generations of evangelicals. In addition to that, young evangelicals absorb and consume information differently than the older generations during their formative years. So this is really essential to understand in terms of understanding the differences that we observe in the generations. Older folks grew up with limited amount of information, with 3 or 4 TV channels that were exposed to Cold War propaganda, where the United States and Israel walked side by side in their fight against the Soviet Union and its Middle East supporters. And the information was controlled. It was very much geared to provide a positive attitude and a positive perception of Israel, whereas now young evangelicals are exposed to much more diverse sources of information. They experience information differently because there are a lot more visual information available. And as we know from the studies of how people consume information, emotionally laden information leaves greater impact on the individual than simple facts or readership.
Yeah.
And so as a result, we see that young evangelicals are just much more attuned to the informational environment today than the older generation.
Yeah, I see that. And Moti, briefly, you also found something that I think is very interesting, that the more a young person said they went to church or read the Bible, the more they were likely to support Israel more strongly than their counterparts who were saying, yeah, I'm an evangelical, but I really don't go to church that much and I don't read the Bible that much. Is that, again, a fair representation of your data?
Yeah. We definitely were able to see that those who are closer to the core of evangelism or evangelical life, like going to church, reading the Bible, they are more kind of like close to the message of the evangelical movement. And those who are distancing themselves and don't go to church and don't read the Bible definitely are distancing themselves also from the worldview of evangelical Christianity in America. So to the point where I was asking myself, why do they even call themselves evangelical?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Identify as evangelicals.
Yeah, we've only got a little bit of time, but I'm going to extend this segment just a bit because I got to ask you guys about. So what do you make of the? I guess Moti will go with you, but what do you make of the idea that the more you talk to a young evangelical, the less inclined they are? Are you sure that that's true, or is that some sort of anomaly in your study?
I'm sure it's true and it makes a lot of sense. Because of this generational divide, they are just sick and tired hearing their parents and their grandparents talking about Israel. It creates a counter effect, They're just sick of it. They just don't want to hear it anymore.
Wow. Well, that's a problem at every level. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your book. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for listening to this episode about young people's reaction to the biblical message about Israel. If you have found this podcast valuable, please be in touch with us. Let us know who you are. Are you someone who's searching for Jesus? We would love to talk to you about that. Do you have any question that you'd love Joel to answer in future podcasts? Please send comments that you might have to podcast@joshuafund.net. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us as we develop this podcast. And as always, you can check out our show notes for anything you heard on this episode that you'd like more information on. For the Joshua Fund Ministry team, I'm Lynn Rosenberg, and thank you for listening to this episode of Inside the Epicenter.
I'm Joel Rosenberg. On your left, you'll find some videos we've chosen specifically for you. We look forward to partnering with you to bless Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus.